wish I could be there in person. I really would love to talk to all of you and listen to your talks and ask questions. I have stopped flying for climate reasons, so that's brings with it a certain sadness. But I'm especially excited. Let me share my screen here. I'm especially excited to be here in this conference because I have a hypothesis that I want to try out with you about literary studies and tragedy. And I don't usually get to talk to tragedy scholars, and I'm not a tragedy scholar myself, so I'm very eager to hear your responses to help me think about this. So my talk will have 4 parts. I'm going to start with a question, a big question about resistance in literary studies, and a case for my own version of formalism. And then I'm going to be talking about how I think other critics plot the climate crisis versus how I would like to tell a story about the climate crisis. So since the 1980s, resistance has been a key word in literary and cultural studies. In its most basic definition, resistance means opposing a powerful force. Now, in literary and cultural studies, scholars have referred to a really wide range of kinds of actions as resistant, from the large-scale armed uprising to the tiny unconventional gesture in a literary text. Broadly speaking, literary scholars tend to fall into 2 camps when it comes to literature and political resistance. So all of you, and there's certainly others in this camp, presumably have strong convictions that reading and studying literature can be sites of resistance. So maybe we argue that experimental poetic language unsettles the logic of capital, or we say that close reading equips people to resist the unthinking acceptance of power. There are all kinds of arguments on the side of literature and resistance. But on the other side are critics who insist that any claim to political power in literary studies is grandiose or even delusional. So John Guillory, for example, singles out Heather Love for what he calls her overestimation of aim. And then he footnotes to me, and he says that my book Forms reinstates justification by faith that just by reading novels, we engage in transformative political work. Just to say that's not true, I don't say or imply that in Forms, because I don't believe that just reading novels is transformative political work, but I am really interested in who and what actually does do transformative political work. What kinds of resistance can transform oppressive power structures? Guillory says that political literary critics are overestimating our aim, which suggests that there are ways of measuring our political aim properly. And implicitly that he knows how much political effect we can have. But what is that measure? And given how much we read and talk about power in our field, it's been really surprising to me to realize how rarely we actually study political impacts or effects. We haven't asked when and how resistance works. For me, a formalist approach has been helpful in beginning to disentangle this question. So, in the arts, the word form typically refers to the patterns, shapes, and structures that organize a work of art, like rhythm or plot or vanishing point perspective. I deliberately define form more broadly than that as any shape or configuration, any arrangement of elements, any ordering or patterning. So for me, a public transportation system can be a form. It's carefully designed, interconnection of parts. So is a classroom schedule. And I argue that politics, the task of living together in groups, is very much a matter of form. So we have constant debates over spatial forms like borders. We also debate organizations of time. And probably the most urgent organization of time that we debate all the time is the narrative of progress. The form that probably causes the most suffering is the hierarchy. But in any case, I argue that politics itself always involves the work of giving form to collective life. Now, to think about the kind of work that forms do in the world, I borrowed the term affordance from design theory. So affordances are the range of things you can do with certain materials or designs. So wax is good for pouring and molding, but it's not good for building bridges. So we would say wax doesn't afford the kind of strength you need to carry people across a river. A dining table is great for small scale conversation or writing a dissertation, but it does not, sorry, gonna get my slides out of order here. Um, but it's not good for mass protests. It doesn't afford mass protests. Across my work, I've argued that most forms, and maybe even all forms, have multiple affordances. So you can't classify any given form as either good or bad in itself. One of my examples is routines, which we usually dislike strongly in literary studies because they're closely associated with monotonous industrial labor. But I think routines also have beneficial affordances. So if you're hungry or unhoused, you might well long for regular meals and regular patterns of sleep. So routines can be oppressive, yes, but they can also be capacitating. Now, it's true that many political forms like racial hierarchies and national borders are really bad. And it's because of forms like these that lots of radical thinkers have said that all forms should be resisted. But that also goes against something we know about living in common. All human communities, as Anna Kornblue has argued, rely on structuration. So I've made the case that all collectives depend on ordering shapes and arrangements just for the project of ordinary survival, like routines of food and rest, pathways for water and waste, and sheltering enclosures. These three forms are in the activist humanist, what I call infrastructures of collective life. They're forms that we need to have in place so that we can do all kinds of other exciting things, including sleep, eat, but also socialize and make art. And it's here that my work departs from the mainstream methodologically. So most formalist literary scholars in recent years have been rigorously historicist. So they've been really interested in how specific forms, like let's say tragic drama, take shape in certain material and cultural conditions. I've been saying, by contrast, that forms are portable and generalizable, which means they take their affordances with them wherever they go across contexts. And it also means that we can put our knowledge of forms to use to design better forms for collective life. So I'm not as interested in where forms come from as in how they can provide us with the blueprints to design and make better worlds. Today, I want to make the case that we're going to need narrative forms for any claims we're going to make about power and resistance. Narrative is one of those forms that crops up across periods and cultures. As far as we know, all human cultures have had narrative forms. Famously, Roman Jakobson argues that poetry relies heavily on metaphor or substitution, and he's got that series of terms, while narrative depends on metonymy or contiguity, one thing linked to the next. So here's my most basic claim today. If we're going to understand how resistance does or does not work against powerful forces, that is, how one thing leads to another, we're going to need narrative. But which narrative? Literary studies scholars today offer up conflicting accounts of historical change. So, for example, Afro-pessimists in the US argue that anti-Black racism has been the primary force shaping US politics and government, while Marxists claim that it's capital that's that basic form, that's been that force that's been shaping our world. Some make the claim that racism is an effect of capitalism, while others say that they happen to coincide. So how can we adjudicate between these different accounts? As far as I can tell, we'll need narrative to do the adjudicating. So all narratives I hypothesize, rest on or imply a theory of causality. So in any given narrative, events might be driven by free will, or poverty, or addiction, or the gods. And none of us can actually ever tell for sure that it's not the gods who are making us act or events turn out in certain ways. In Provincializing Europe, Dipesh Chakrabarty argues that we can't actually reconcile different models of causality. So he gives that famous example where secular historians who are studying 19th century Indian labor will see that labor as a effect of material social processes, but many of the laborers themselves will say that they're driven by divine forces. Such histories represent a meeting of two systems of thought, he says. So there's a kind of radical relativism hovering here that we can't decide between these different accounts. It's certainly an anti-foundationalism. But I think formalism can also help to ground us here. So I've said that I don't think you can have narrative without some theory of causality. And I think we can claim the opposite too. We can't know causality without narrative form, without telling stories about what leads to what. So narratives necessarily mediate our knowledge of how things unfold and are connected, which means that stories themselves do the work of persuading us of one version of causality rather than another. The proof is in the narrative pudding. So, in other words, when it comes to understanding which kinds of resistance bring about real social transformation, we need to tell stories and figure out which of them is most convincing. So, we need to focus on how specific narratives connect the dots between acts of resistance and social change, and then see whether those hold up, whether they're persuasive. I do think that most literary critics already implicitly or explicitly rely on some idea of how historical events are connected. So part of my goal is to draw out those implicit theories of causality in order to figure out which ones we find persuasive. This conference is a great opportunity for me because I think most literary critics right now are narrating the climate crisis as tragedy. So I'm going to lean heavily on Hayden White here, and I'm going to point out three related tragic modes of historical implotment that I think are at work in the field right now. Then I'm going to argue for a comic plot as a more persuasive account of the relationship between resistance and power. So I'm organizing these three different plots in literary studies according to genres of tragedy. The first is Sophoclean tragedy, and here I'm thinking particularly of Oedipus. So I'm going to start with Anahid Nersessian, a scholar of Romantic poetry. There's nothing meaningful to be done to stop climate breakdown, Nersessian argues. So we have to reconcile ourselves to the brute fact of suffering. The task of the aesthetic discipline, she writes, is to face the traumatic knowledge that climate catastrophe is certain and unfathomable. Nersessian explains that literature and all other human efforts at resistance are going to just turn out to be puny and pitiful. Romantic poets are as limited as any other cultural producers and any other historical persons in their ability to challenge or subvert the status quo. Wordsworth is onto something when he says that his poems might cooperate, however feebly, with state-based welfare programs. The feeble is lamentable, weepy. It's also weak in the structural as well as the moral vein. For Nersessian, then, romantic poetry gives us the experience of feeling the traumas of the Industrial Revolution, but she says the romantics are right not to try to grasp, represent, or act on that trauma. It follows then that Nersessian herself doesn't really try to understand or represent the historical forces that bring about ecocide either. She just asserts that people in literature are weak compared to the juggernaut of history. She writes, Jameson famously tells us that history is what hurts. The specific ache romanticism nurses comes from the sensation of its own disengagement from that hurt and the attempt, which always fails, to correct it. That doesn't make it any easier to bear. So the pain is heavy, but there's nothing any historical person can do to stop it. And so the best that we can do is to try to bear it. We have to face that traumatic knowledge. Fixed and preordained climate catastrophe seems to me here in Nercessian a lot like the gods in Oedipus Rex. They can't be known, and they exert their massive and destructive power no matter how much we, like Oedipus, long to shift the course of fate. Now, a slightly different tragic plot shapes Nathan Hensley's Action Without Hope, which just appeared in 2025. Here I'm going to draw on Shakespeare. So Hensley agrees with Nercessian that climate breakdown is effectively unstoppable. He argues that the system of capitalist extractivism is so all-encompassing that we can't escape it. We're trapped in a total carceral situation defined by foreclosed possibility and fully entrenched social processes. Unlike Nercessian, Hensley does carve out a space for political resistance, but it's deliberately small in scale. He repeatedly uses the word tiny. So, for example, he invites us to focus on tiny but consequential adjustments within the shipwreck of the modern project. Tiny moments of hesitating creation and non-standard expression, however vanishing. So he particularly focuses on brushstrokes in paintings and typographical irregularities in poems. These are the only meaningful acts of resistance. Any larger scale acts are troubling, he says, because they'll only recapitulate the logics of instrumental reason and extractive capital. So if we were to try to reduce emissions, for example, we just fall into the trap of measuring outcomes, which is the consummate logic of economic thinking. Or if we try to find solutions, we're just falling into the language of neoliberal corporations. Even calls to revolution only deepen the dominant ideology, Hensley argues, because they imply a politics of what he calls unfettered will and completed projects. This leaves us with just one option for resistance, according to Hensley, which is to torque a fallen idiom from the inside, interrupting the smooth functionality of a world whose obscenity is coded into the very structures of everyday thought and speech. So Hensley, like Nercessian, offers us a narrative of history that heads inexorably toward climate breakdown. He does see aesthetic experience as a valuable form of resistance, and these small-scale interruptions, though, are not escapes, and they don't change the course of history. They just offer us glimmers of a different kind of relationality, a different way of being together. They show how material connection between remaindered lives might be made real. The sobs of one unprotected body connecting its trial to another's. Solidarity with others in struggle, therefore, is one possible concrete outcome of these infrared adjustments to the given. Now, I don't know whether you scholars of early modern tragedy will agree, and I defer to your expertise, but Hensley's plot reminds me of Lear's brief moments with Cordelia near the end, as they recognize each other in suffering in glimpses, and they're thwarted by timing, but they're also reaching for one another in expressions of love. None of this changes the outcome, but Lear's terrible knowledge of his own complicity does yield a new capacity for reciprocity and genuine connection. Now, of course, Lear's reckoning happens on the individual scale, and most literary critics have been focused on the systems and structures that shape our ecocidal present. My third example comes from literary critics who are interested in gauging the power of the individual person trying to resist large systemic forces. So here I'm borrowing directly from Hayden White, and specifically his reading of 19th century French historian Alexis de Tocqueville. White explains that Tocqueville confronts two major modes of historical narrative in his time. One's aristocratic and the other is democratic. So Tocqueville writes, when the historian of aristocratic ages surveys the theater of the world, he at once perceives a very small number of prominent actors who manage the whole piece. These great personages who occupy the front of the stage arrest attention and fix it upon themselves. And while the historian is bent on penetrating the secret motives which make these persons speak and act, the others escape his memory. So we could say that the aristocratic historian is committed to the form of protagonism, tracking the great men who've shaped history. By contrast, White writes, the democratic historian seeks to discover some larger meaning in the mass of petty details which he discerns on the historical stage. He's driven to refer to everything, not to individuals at all, but only to great, abstract, and general forces. So Tocqueville sees these as two kinds of historical narration, but also really importantly as two kinds of forces at work in his present, and they're in a kind of dynamic tension. So as the aristocratic type of power is declining, the democratic type is gathering force. Other 19th century historians will hail the process of democratization as increasing freedom, but for Tocqueville, it's a tragedy because it squelches all individual human gifts and talents. Here's White paraphrasing Tocqueville. The growth of these forces was viewed by him, that is Tocqueville, not as a sporadic or casual process, but as a sustained and constant erosion of precious human resources, intellectual, moral, and emotional. The whole process has the inevitability of a tragic drama. Now, I'm going to take some big liberties with Tocqueville here because the social world of our current climate crisis is very different from his moment. But I want to make the case that many eco-critical accounts of the climate crisis rest on something like a Tocquevillian tension between individual human agency and large dispersed forces. Eco-critics, like Tocqueville's democratic historians, tend to argue that if too much of a focus on individual humans misses all the other forces at work. So literary environmental scholars like Stacy Alimo have repeatedly stressed the entanglement of humans in multi-species ecologies. We're not ever really solitary sovereign agents. Our animal bodies are vulnerable to and dependent on all kinds of non-human others. So these critics argue that we do terrible wrongs when we think of ourselves as masters or conquerors of the non-human world. So they're very much against Tocqueville's aristocratic protagonists. Instead, we should think of ourselves as enmeshed in these larger forces, part of the fabric of a larger world. And certainly attempts to exert that kind of protagonist's force in the world leads to destruction of ecological life. And so Alimo, like other scholars, all of these groups of people have urged humans to embrace a deliberate withdrawal, kind of epistemic humility and minor gestures. Staying deliberately small is best because that way we do the least possible harm. The Anthropocene is no time for transcendent, definitive mappings, transparent knowledge systems, or confident epistemologies. This is Alimo. Surely all those things got us into this predicament to begin with. But it seems to me interesting and important that for critics like Alimo, who are like Tocqueville's democratic historians, focused on large abstract forces, major harm is going to continue no matter what we do because these forces, unleashed by colonizing European man in the form of capitalism and colonialism, are going to continue to do their worst. So there's nothing we can do to slow or stop ecocide. Like Hensley, though, Alimo does carve out a special role for art. Her examples, she says, are often whimsical or jocular. perhaps because improvisation is playful, or at least cannot be authoritative or haughty. So one of her examples is La Tigresa, who strips for the trees, chases down loggers, and shouts poetry at them through a bullhorn. So whimsical examples are good because they can't be authoritative or haughty like Enlightenment man. But Alaimo both writes a whole book about these whimsical acts and warns us not to see them as effective acts of of resistance. She warns us not to see them in a narrative of effective resistance. The modes of environmental activism that are analyzed here could be dismissed as failures, and that they hardly halt the carbon economy, the clear-cutting of forests, the devastation of ocean environments, or the proliferation of plastics. But within the scale of the Anthropocene, surely all activism, all politics, all ethics, and all government policies will have been colossal failures. And yet, as Rosie Braidotti insists, we nonetheless continue on for the hell of it and for the love of the world. So we're close to Narcessian here in the feeble power of the ordinary person, and we're close to Hensley in seeing art as a momentary glimpse of another world. But I'd say that Alaimo's implantment is specifically Tocquevillian because Tocqueville gives us the blueprint for telling a historical narrative in which protagonists, with all of their creativity and inventiveness, are always and necessarily swamped by general rules. So the irony here is that as a post-humanist, Alaimo is on the side of Tocqueville's democratic historians, but here she seems on the side of Tocqueville's aristocrats in the sense that she's celebrating a world where interesting and creative individuals are being swamped by mass culture. So she ends up on the side of the democratic historian when she urges us to make ourselves small in the face of the non-human world. But I'm going to say that there are really three agents of history tangled up together in her book Exposed. The book is organized around creative protagonists, which seems to evoke Tocqueville's model of aristocratic history. But then we have two kinds of democratic forces, some dangerous, like capitalism, and others benignantly non or transhuman, like queer fish in her book. Narcessian, Hensley, and Alaimo all plot the history of climate collapse as tragically inexorable. All three carve out some kind of special place for the aesthetic. So for Narcessian, poetry gives us the experience of feeling historical trauma, registering it while refusing to try to grasp it. For Hensley, tiny aberrations point to possibilities of solidarity amid the wreckage. And Alaimo takes pleasure in whimsical and creative expressions of interspecies fluidity. In all three, the aesthetic remains small and powerless against the forces of ecocide, which are massive and unalterable. None of these, I'd argue, offer us any hope of resistance that would actually change the status quo. I've been offering a very different narrative of climate collapse from these three critics, and I'd like to build my case for a different kind of historical emplotment by arguing against three of the premises that govern the tragic models we see here. So Narcessian, Hensley, and Alaimo all paint capitalist extractivism as a massive and unstoppable juggernaut. It tends to be imagined by them and other critics as kind of shadowy and abstract, working mysteriously but all powerfully. So all three emplotments of history that we saw seem to assume that capitalism is kind of godlike in its power. In my own research, I've been struck instead by how a surprisingly small number of people are actually keeping the coal, oil, and gas fires burning. Just 32 fossil fuel companies are emitting more than half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Every few years, the public gets worried about climate change and angry and starts pointing the fingers at big oil. And in response, the fossil fuel companies launch campaigns to try to take back the narrative. And it turns out, if you follow the money, that just a handful of funders have poured millions into spreading climate denial, influencing the media, lobbying politicians, and working to pass anti-climate laws. So some of their big campaigns include, in the 1990s, they called environmentalists chicken littles, and they pushed recycling despite knowing full well that that wouldn't work to stop the climate crisis. Uh, in the 2000s, they claimed that they were investing in leading in new technologies that would lead the energy transition, though in fact they were doing nothing of the kind. And throughout this period up until today, they've been casting doubt on climate science. One of the most fascinating and powerful campaigns, which you may know of, was that BP invented the carbon footprint in 2005 to get us to pay attention to our own culpability rather than pointing our fingers at the fossil fuel industry. So the fossil fuel companies, there are not very many of them, and there are not very many of their oligarchs who are funding these huge public relations campaigns. They would love us to believe that they're godlike and unstoppable in their power. They'd also be delighted for us to think that the causes of ecocide are vastly dispersed and even hidden. But what I see instead is a surprisingly small number of profiteers working to retain a dominant position against wave after wave of opposition. The industry is vulnerable and worried, actively worried about its vulnerability. This brings me to my second shift away from the tragic implodements of the climate crisis. All three critics we looked at imagine the site of resistance as the ordinary person, and they dwell on the failures and the incapacities of that person to make change. I agree that no single one of us can by ourselves do anything really meaningful to stop climate collapse. I also agree that the West's long love affair with the sovereign individual is dangerous. But if we shift from individual to collective protagonists, we get a very different historical implodement. That is, I think research shows quite clearly that large, organized groups of ordinary people can, in fact, exert meaningful pressure on states and corporations and get them to change. I'll just give you two quick examples. The People's Climate March in 2014 led to the formation of a group called New York Renews, which is an organization that helped to pass a really far-reaching climate justice law across New York State in 2019 called the CLCPA, which has very ambitious emissions targets and has been moving New York State, which has the economy of many nations, towards low emissions. Another example, in 2024, Youth for Climate Action in South Korea successfully sued the government for inadequate greenhouse gas reduction targets. And in both cases, climate activists are responsible for bringing down emissions on a large scale. Not surprisingly, then, big oil is afraid of protesters. In the US, ExxonMobil, Enbridge, and Koch Industries, among others, have successfully lobbied 18 US states to pass laws that protect oil and gas infrastructures from peaceful protesters. And you'll notice if you look at the language of the laws, they're very similar. They're almost word for word, and that's because they're all coming from one think tank called ALEC, which is pushing this legislation and being funded mostly by Koch Industries. This isn't just a US phenomenon either. Oil and gas companies around the world are pushing for anti-terrorism laws to target climate organizations, saying that peaceful protesters are threats to national security. For the past few years, I've been studying the forms that activists use to beat back governments and corporations. One form I've argued that's been crucial to successful resistance is what I call the hinge. That is, links between existing groups or organizations. So hinges help groups to scale up to large sizes so that they can have an impact. And I would say that the recent incredibly amazing resistance in Minneapolis against ICE in the US is a great example of the hinge. So I just put on the side of the screen just a handful of the organizations that have been hinged together, along with national organizations like the Indivisible Project and the ACLU, churches, labor unions, mutual aid networks. And one crucial reason that the movement in Minneapolis has mobilized such a rapid and coordinated response is that groups have been able to reactivate the hinges that had already connected multiple groups in 2020 when massive protests erupted against racist police violence sparked by the murder of George Floyd. So past activist forms, including hinges between environmental, racial justice, and faith organizations, provide the groundwork for strong new movements to take shape, which themselves can shift and limit state and corporate power. This brings me to my third response to the tragic implotments so beloved of literary studies. We saw that Nersesi and Hensley and Nalaimo all converged in their assumption that a single tragic ending was inevitable. I've been hearing this kind of climate doomism since the early 2000s, and you might remember Jonathan Franzen writing this in 2019. He's just one of many people willing to throw in the towel on the environment and declare it's too late to do anything to stop climate breakdown. What would it mean instead to tell a story where resistance works, a story of victory over the lies and devastations of the fossil fuel industry? A comedy. I can almost hear you gasp in horror. Across so many different schools of thought, literary and cultural studies scholars have insisted over and over again that happy endings are bad. We're told that they always restore the dominant moral and sexual order. Teleology is one of those terms you can say with contempt, and you don't even have to explain why. Um, Surely I'm not claiming that happy endings can be good politics, but actually I am. One form that I've seen as crucial to successful resistance, like the hinge, is the goal, the telos, organizing people according to a clear arc that ends in victory, a happy ending. So one of the examples I bring up a lot is the famous example of the Montgomery bus boycott that was part of the US civil rights movement in the 1950s. This was the nonviolent protest against segregated busing that was launched by Rosa Parks. Organizers knew that the boycott needed to last a long time because they had to wear down the opposition. And this meant that thousands of people had to stop using the buses, which were convenient. And how is it possible to keep a large group of people going through such a long slog? The organizers of this protest said that they should stay focused on the real chance of victory and keep pushing towards a specific happy ending. That would give meaning and purpose to the hard work of boycotting and inspire people to keep going. Now, most literary critics say that, oh, we shouldn't tell stories with happy endings because they make us passive and complacent. But part of the reason I tell the Montgomery bus boycott story is that exactly the opposite was true in this case. So, victory in Montgomery made change seem possible and so helped to activate and spread civil rights activism across the US South and bring down the rule of Jim Crow. British Marxist John Molina argues that struggling and winning are precisely what leads to more struggles and more wins. It's often supposed that the more people suffer, the more revolutionary they become. But if this were so, then the revolution would have happened long ago. In fact, it is not suffering, but the experience of fighting against suffering that forms the material basis for the growth of socialist ideas. If victory follows victory, the workers' confidence in their ability to change their own lives rises, and they become more able to see that alternatives to capitalism are possible. So if winning, celebrating a happy ending, is in fact a crucial ingredient to rousing people to struggle, then literary critics' relentless insistence on the inevitability of tragic devastation is actually hampering the possibility of effective resistance. There's also obviously a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy at work. You tell people resistance won't work, they don't bother to resist, and then the tragic storytellers turn out to have been right. Big oil would be positively thrilled to learn that literary critics are trying to convince us to stay home, focus on tiny aesthetic gestures, and let climate breakdown continue because we don't believe there's any meaningful way for us to stop it. But that means that literary critics' warnings against activism are not just not radical, they're actively nourishing an ideology of unbreakable corporate power. So let me end my own talk with a happy ending. In the US right now, 230 organizations and that includes all kinds of organizations, Food and Water Watch, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Dakota Rural Action, Artivism Virginia. They're hinging together to create a nationwide resistance to the building of AI data centers. This is a massive coalition of ordinary people that includes indigenous communities, church groups, and socialists. We've now managed to block data centers worth $64 billion and to scare big tech. The oligarchs are worried. The movement is growing fast. So I'm curious, is this a narrative that makes you want to join in? Thank you.